to go.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's particularly exciting to be at Cal Lutheran again, or sort of at Cal Lutheran, I guess. All right, so as he mentioned, we're going to think about stereotypes in entrepreneurship. So if you do a basic Google search for the word entrepreneur or famous entrepreneur, this is a sampling of the types of pictures you get. I mean, these people obviously need no introduction. We all know who they are. But it bears noting that they're all leaders of, or 3 out of 4 are leaders of tech companies. All of them are in heavily traditionally male-typed industries. And they're all huge companies, right? Kind of ubiquitous. Now, if you scroll down a few more pages, or to the very bottom, you see a few more female faces. Obviously, you know who Oprah and Martha Stewart are. And then to the right of that, we have Sally Fields, who was it Sally Fields? No, not Debbie Fields. Sorry, wrong Fields. Debbie Fields, who started the Mrs. Fields Cookie Company, and then, of course, Mary Kay Ash, who runs Mary Kay Cosmetics, right? So it bears noting, of course, these women are all extremely successful in their own right, but they've all built their businesses around kind of stereotypically feminine products and activities, right? Cosmetics, cooking, et cetera. And their businesses aren't quite as big. So none of them, for instance, are in the Fortune 500 compared to the top. So this is just kind of a quick illustration of some of the broader patterns that we see in entrepreneurship in general. So women are dramatically less likely than men to be entrepreneurs in the first place. So for instance, men are 2 times more likely to start a business in any given month than women, and that's been pretty consistent over the last several decades, actually. And when we compare these patterns with other basic patterns in the labor market, it's a pretty stark contrast. So about 43% of all managers, legislators, and managers, legislators, and senior managers are women, but only 28% of all private firms are owned or majority owned and operated by women. And finally, in the venture capital world, which is actually a very small fraction of all new businesses get venture capital funding, but of those, only 3% of the venture capital funds have gone to women-owned businesses in the last few years. So we have some pretty usual suspects to explain these patterns, right? On the one hand, you say, well, okay, women are less likely to be employed at the top of companies, so they might be less likely to have the important networks that they need to start a business. They might be less likely to have the human capital, so to speak. They might have fewer financial resources. A lot of entrepreneurs put their own money, as you probably know, put a lot of their own money into starting a new business. And on average, women have less wealth than men. Another issue is industry backgrounds. So women might be in, let's say, more feminine-typed occupations like nursing or caregiving, which are less conducive to starting one's own business than maybe more male-dominated technology companies. And then they might run smaller businesses because they want to, or they might have lower growth orientations for different reasons. And then finally, people have suggested that there might be a difference in the way that women just are less, they might be, how should I put it, have a higher fear of failure, right? So they might be less prone to start a business. They might have less confidence in their ability to start a business. So these personality differences or perceptions might be driving the difference that we see in the broader patterns. But study after study that tries to control for all of these kinds of factors show that there's still a pretty persistent gap, even if we adjust for people's backgrounds and their personalities and all of these kinds of usual suspects. So that brings me to the question of what I would call unconscious bias. We know that in management, in what I would call wage and salaried employment, there's a lot of evidence that women face unconscious biases, which is people tend to assume that they're less competent or less achievement-oriented than their male counterparts on average, and as a result, they tend to be rewarded less for their achievements and sometimes held to a stricter standard. So we know that those patterns tend to crop up in organizations, but my question is, does this happen in entrepreneurship, and if so, why? But first, a quick thing about unconscious bias. So we know that this kind of bias is driven by these widely held stereotypes about gender, and these stereotypes tend to have what we call male biasing or male advantaging outcomes. So what happens when people have this kind of very vague sense of gender stereotypes in their head? Well, it results in an error in decision making. So it's a cognitive shortcut, is another way of putting this. So when we see a piece of information, we tend to judge it systematically differently based on the gender. So if somebody comes in and does the exact same thing, we may judge that exact same performance differently on the basis of their gender. So objective information is systematically being evaluated differently. So this is a good example of what we call the double standard, which is that there's a higher bar often that we set for women. So women have to demonstrate more evidence of competence, experience, et cetera, their credentials, in order to be perceived as equally promotion worthy, let's say, in an organization. A critical fact here, though, is that these biases are often unintentional and they occur out of awareness. So even if someone is completely, like they want to promote women, everyone's susceptible to it to some degree if they're not paying attention. Even me, I would admit. And they're typically shared by men and women, you might be surprised to hear. Few studies actually show systematic differences, so in terms of the gender of the person who's making the evaluation. So even though we like to think that it's an in-group kind of thing, women are gonna help women, it's not so much about that. It's more about our widely shared conscious expectations about what men and women are like or should be like. And finally, though, we know some critical ways that these biases can be reduced and or eliminated. So I'll talk a bit about how we might be able to do that in the entrepreneurship context. All right, so we have recent evidence that this is, as you mentioned about the Ellen Powell case, there is recent, much more systematic evidence that there is gender bias in the entrepreneurship world. So across this is not my research, but research of others, across 3 entrepreneurial pitch competitions and 4 experimental studies with various different participants, consistently they find that there's a systematic tendency for people to prefer pitches that are presented by male entrepreneurs than by female entrepreneurs, even when the content of the pitch is the same or the exact technology is the same, right? So what do you think of when you think of a stereotypical entrepreneur? What are the traits and characteristics that come to mind? Driven, okay. Yeah. Focused? Risk taker? Good. Creative? Visionary, innovative? Great. Anything else? Charming, charismatic? Yeah. Great. Okay. So, well, actually, okay, now think about some gender stereotypes. Can anybody name some gender stereotypes about the way you think men are? Excuse me?
For example, I've been called, I remember I started my company in the 90s, I've been called too aggressive as a woman. The thing is if it was a guy, he'd just be called assertive.
That's one of them. So aggressive, assertive, we tend to associate with men.
Right.
Any other traits? Yeah, exactly. Any other traits we associate with men or women? Mm-hmm.
Mother, take care of children.
Right, so being kind of communal or community-oriented and caring.
Leaving work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So like commitment to family versus work. Mm-hmm.
Attractive. You don't refer to Bill Gates as being attractive.
That's true.
He's not attractive. You don't refer to that.
That's true. Attractiveness plays in more for women. I have a study on that, actually. We can talk about it after. That's an interesting point. Sorry? Oh, attractiveness. People tend to focus on women's physical attractiveness more than men's physical attractiveness. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Right. Okay, so I think we kind of all know what that is. Basically, the point here is that the stereotypes that we tend to associate with entrepreneurs, so being driven, being aggressive, being creative, being innovative, all of those things, those kinds of traits are what we call intensely proscribed and described, or prescribed and described for men. So people on average, studies have shown that people on average tend to think that these traits, men exhibit these traits more often than women, and that they should exhibit these traits more often than women, right? So there's kind of a prescriptive edge, normative edge to this as well. So in short, when men are entrepreneurs, they're living up to this image of how we think men are and how they should be, right? Whereas when women become entrepreneurs, we're not quite sure what to do with them. Okay, so there's a few different reasons why we might be able to explain these penalties that are pretty pervasive that we know women encounter, at least in some circumstances. So as I mentioned, it could be that people doubt that women possess the entrepreneurial traits or abilities or skills that we think that they need to possess. And as a result, maybe women have to provide additional evidence of that ability than men, so that hurdle, right? There's like a higher bar set for women. And it just boils down to skill and competence and ability. Like they're just not going to be as competent as their male counterparts. That could be is that the story? Another explanation, which kind of gets to your point, I'm glad you brought that up, is this prescriptive edge, right? Which is, at least in studies of women and managers, we see what they call the backlash effect, which is even when women demonstrate a high degree of they're assertive enough, they're competent enough, all of those things, it rubs people the wrong way. Because it's like, well, women shouldn't necessarily be too dominant. And so because of that, they tend to be personally derogated or disliked because of that. So maybe it's that women entrepreneurs, by going out there and being aggressive and getting funding, it kind of turns people off, right? So maybe it's not about if they think that they're competent. It's actually this backlash effect. And finally, it could be that, well, entrepreneurial, the context varies widely. And as I mentioned before, women are less likely to be in these male-dominated industries that are associated with male-type skills, right? So engineering, for instance. Maybe it's that we associate engineering and new technologies with men, and that's why women have a hard time in those industries. But as long as women are doing cosmetics, they'll be fine because they're not violating any stereotypes. Or maybe it's cultural context. So pockets of people might be who are more gender egalitarian, or where women are more, there's a higher fraction of women entrepreneurs. Maybe we wouldn't see as much bias, and that's kind of going on. That's what's explaining this. All right, so to try to kind of tease apart these possible explanations, and actually to back up, the reason why I did this was not to demonstrate that there's bias, because we kind of know that there's bias. I think that's kind of a boring point. But to see why there's bias, because if we know why there's a bias, then we can start to figure out how to fix the bias, hopefully. All right, so I conducted 3 experimental studies that were at large universities in the US and in the UK. And Each participant came into the lab and they rated one innovative pitch and one non-innovative pitch that were by fictitious entrepreneurs. And they were presented as real, though. The participants believed that they were real, by individuals of the same gender, qualifications, and whose ideas were in the same industries. But what I did was I randomly assigned people to evaluate either female entrepreneurs or male entrepreneurs. A quick note, the importance of random assignment here, for anyone who's not familiar with experiments, it helps us to estimate the direct or the causal effect of the gender of the entrepreneur or the innovativeness of the plan, because things that might be confounded, like a person's personal background or I don't know, their political beliefs or the area that they come from, all those idiosyncrasies about individuals are randomly distributed between the two groups. So we know that that's not driving. If we see a difference between the two groups, we know that that's not driving the difference. And so people came in, they were told that they were going to evaluate submissions to a small business venture competition that occurred a few years prior, and that the researcher has data on whether or not these firms were successful, kind of like the rate of return, I guess, that these companies ended up with. And depending on the accuracy, they were going to be asked to evaluate the plan and the entrepreneur. So they evaluated them on a series of measures, whether they thought they were competitive, whether they thought they were investment worthy, profitable, et cetera. And then they were asked to make a decision about investment. So they were given investment, quote unquote, points that they were meant to assign to each company. And then depending on the accuracy of their decision, they could earn extra money from they were being paid money to participate, but they could, in theory, earn more if they were correct. So there was an incentive to make or focus on the task and make accurate decisions. And I should note, too, that so I looked at innovative versus non-innovative because, as was mentioned even here, innovation is kind of a critical variable in entrepreneurial pitches, right? So here I wanted to kind of capture that distinction between the non-innovative business was something that kind of replicates another business that's out there. So we can all think of the pizza shop down the street that maybe it has a different name, maybe it has a different logo, but it's effectively the same thing, versus an innovative product or service that is doing something really radical and new and that nobody's really seen before, right? So it's much more risky. So the first two studies were conducted. I wanted to compare participants across the two contexts. So I looked at participants in the UK context and then in the US context. And in kind of a gender-balanced retail industry. I can talk more about the details of the vignettes that I used in all the testing I did for it, but I kind of want to cut to the chase. So if you have questions, let me know in the Q&A. And it was both gender stereotyped, gender balanced, and then I also told them in the actual vignette that 50% of the owners in this industry tend to be women. So to try to make sure. And I confirmed that that was the case in the responses. And then finally, I did a third study looking at a high-tech industry because I wanted to compare whether there would be differences based on whether it was a male-typed task or not. All right, so the first main finding is that across all three of the studies, when they were pitching a typical, so like a non-innovative kind of standard run-of-the-mill business, women were consistently rated as less competent or skilled than their male counterparts, but not any less likable or less committed, surprisingly, to their venture. Because I thought, well, it could also be about commitment, right? Maybe people think, okay, well, women, they're not as committed to their career. Didn't find evidence of that. Now, this is a young sample of participants, so it could be that, we know that younger people tend to have more progressive gender ideologies, so it's kind of a conservative test. But it really boiled down to this idea about skill, and competent. Are they competent to carry out the activities of the business? And in some cases, evaluators also rated the quality of the business to be lower. And when that happened, I was able to show that that was because of the rating of competence. So they rated them lower because they felt that they were less competent or skilled. The second finding was that these biases were actually mitigated when the pitch was perceived and was, in reality, much more innovative than the other plan. And finally, the patterns of bias were somewhat stronger in the UK sample, which is kind of what I expected, because in the UK, there's even fewer women entrepreneurs than there are here. So even though there aren't very many here, the situation's even worse over there. And then also, surprisingly, well, somewhat surprisingly, somewhat not surprisingly, there wasn't that much of a difference between the high-tech industry and the gender-neutral industry. So I'll walk you through the actual findings real quick and then unpack what these results mean. So in the first study, we can see on the left-hand side, women were rated significantly less competent than their male counterparts. And on the right-hand side, they were allocated significantly fewer investment points than their male counterparts. So that's that outcome variable I talked about when they were supposed to, the really important one. The second study, same pattern. Women were rated, in this case, it was a skill, which is pretty similar to competence. Women were rated to be less skilled, and again, allocated fewer investment points, but it was slightly fewer, so not quite as large of a gap as the first study. And then the third study, remember, is the high-tech industry. It was actually a geothermal unit, which was the innovative design in that one. But women were rated significantly less skilled again than their counterparts. But in this one, actually the investment points measure wasn't a significant difference. It's actually fairly similar in the investment points, right? So you might think, oh, wow, that's interesting. You might think, oh, women are more penalized here. But at the same time, I think what's going on is people say, oh, wow, a woman in technology, good for her, right? So you kind of get this counterbalancing effect. Now, what happens when we consider innovation for the men? So if you look to the left-hand side, the left two bars here, men were rated less competent and less investment-worthy than their male counterparts who were non-innovative. So pitching a novel idea was actually a bad thing for men, at least in the UK sample. And this makes sense, too, because depending on the evaluator, if the evaluator is a risk-averse person, they're going to say, hey, that's risky. I'm going to go with this plan that I know is going to work, that's tried and true, over this novel plan. But when we move to the US, it's not quite that sort of risk-averse evaluation was less common. So no difference on the skill measure, that didn't matter for men. And also investment points, men were allocated fewer investment points again, which is kind of consistent. With the innovation, with the high-tech industry, however, we again see no difference for men in perceived skill, depending on whether they were presenting an innovative project or not, and also no difference in the investment ratings, possibly because in a high-tech field, we like to see innovation, right? That's kind of where innovation happens. So overall, ratings of men were pretty idiosyncratic, depending on the evaluator and the context, right? So depending on if the innovation is perceived to be risky by the evaluator, you kind of see these patterns. So there's no consistent pattern for men, effectively. And in most cases, innovation doesn't systematically help or hurt them. I mean, it kind of hurts them in the gender-neutral industry, but however, story is very similar for women all the way across all three. So women were rated more competent, and interestingly, they were not penalized in terms of investment, which is saying a lot given that this sample was seemed to be so risk-averse for the men when they pitch a novel idea. So when they're innovative, it's like, oh wow, she's competent, and actually maybe it's worth investing in this business. And again, they're rated more skilled in the second study, rated more skilled and more deserving of investment when they present an innovative, novel idea. And finally, the same pattern emerges again in the high-tech industry. So consistently across all studies, we see that women kind of catch up. And here's a good example of this double standards effect. You see that men, skill doesn't really matter, but women kind of catch up, if that makes sense. By presenting an innovative idea, then it's like they kind of catch up to where the ratings of the men are. And I should add, too, that I asked them another question at the very end of the survey to kind of get their ideas about, well, can you explain what your reasoning was behind the investment decisions you made? And time and again, for the women, I had comments like, well, she's much more competent because she's presenting a novel idea. This is such a novel idea. This is so great. She's doing this. She's so competent. Whereas for men, it was not tied to their personal traits. It was just based on the actual business plan. Like, do I think this plan is going to work, or do I think this plan is not going to work, right? So basically, the summary, at least from this first study, is that bias tends to emerge from the stereotypes about women's abilities in entrepreneurship, and not so much about stereotypes about their commitment or likability. So it's not so much that women are violating some proscription that they ought not to be doing this kind of thing, but just that people don't think that they're going to be able to do it. Or that they don't possess the background or the skills that they would need. Women entrepreneurs are systematically, actually, I'm going to go back to this for a second. I think there's a clear explanation for why I did not find this backlash effect in this study, and that's because psychologists have now uncovered that this dislikability, or that women aren't seen as, or they're seen as dislikable when they're too aggressive, is due to our stereotypes that women ought not to be dominant over other people, right? So it's not about, well, that they should be more motherly, or that they should be nicer or something. It's not so much about that. It's more about that people get their feathers ruffled when women are telling other people what to do too much. Now, with entrepreneurs, you aren't necessarily in that position, right? You're not necessarily telling people what to do all the time, or at least in the context of a pitch. You're just kind of going out there and saying, hey, this is what I'm doing. So that it doesn't activate that particular stereotype in this context. Of course, if you start hiring people and all that, then it might change, right? Okay, so the second finding, of course, is that women are seen as systematically more qualified when they pitch innovative ideas. And here it's that because women are actually fitting this image, stereotypical image of what we have for what an entrepreneur is supposed to be like when they're doing this. So basically, innovation for women is the actual innovation seems to be judged as partial compensation for this personality trait or ability that they're perceived to lack. Whereas for men, it tends to be judged on the basis, it's not wrapped up with stereotypes about how people believe men actually are or should be. So basically, this is the double standard. Women have to work harder to fit the image. And finally, the bias in entrepreneurship cannot be largely attributed to these variability in industries. So there's something fundamental about the act of starting a business that activates bias. All right, so you might be thinking, okay, well, these studies were a small, well, it wasn't a small group, but there was like a couple hundred people. But, relatively speaking, what about the general population? You know, we have lots of different people out there evaluating things. These are young people. What do they know about running a business, et cetera? So in a second study, I've been looking at prosper.com. Does anybody here know what prosper.com is? One? Okay. Okay. So it's an online site for peer-to-peer, what they call peer-to-peer lending. It's one of the first sites where crowdfunding started, but you can get money from anyone on the internet, basically, for a variety of purposes. So maybe you want, you need some extra money to fix up your house. You need money for your child's college education. You're starting a business. There are lots of different reasons that people go onto Prosper. So with a colleague of mine and I, we got a whole bunch of data from Prosper. Everybody has a profile and information about your credit score, your background, why you're looking for money, et cetera. And so we went through and we had people code all of that information, and we put it into a model. So it's not quite like an experiment, but it's as close as you're going to get in the real world to being able to hold constant all these variables that could otherwise affect people's propensity to invest or give money to someone. So the first claim that I kind of just made with that other data was that these biases in entrepreneurship emerge because this act of starting and running a business is somehow associated with stereotypes that we link to men in ways that we don't link them to other activities, right? So what we find, consistent with that account, we find that when women are trying to start a business, they encounter significant penalties. No matter how you measure the funding, we measured it like 4 different ways. It's really robust. So by the dollar amount, whether they ended up getting the loan, the fraction of amount that they sought, et cetera, across all of those variables, as soon as a woman mentions business purposes, they get dinged. Now, if they're mentioning something like a home loan, child's education, all these other kind of reasons that aren't necessarily as associated with these agentic stereotypes, these aggressiveness, et cetera, we don't see a penalty. The second claim is that the impact of gender stereotypes associated with entrepreneurship in general, that there's this general thing about the activity of entrepreneurship and not the certain industries, that is what activates the bias. So what we did then is we further coded all of the businesses that people were starting. So, you know, were they starting a childcare business from their home, or were they starting a construction business, right? Or a tech, you know, online, a new website or something, right? And we had a whole bunch of coders code this, so it was consistent. And so, interestingly, the more masculine seeming the business, the slightly stronger disadvantage women had, right? But it was only slightly disadvantaged. So even if women are proposing to start a childcare business, right, which is perfectly consistent with stereotypes about, oh, well, women can do that, they still are penalized compared to if they had asked for a home loan or something, right? So there's something going on with business and running a business. All right, so what are the implications of all this? So even small, we know from a lot of other studies that even small biases can accumulate over social interactions and over time to produce inequalities. So a good example of this is in organizations. If you have a 0% bias, you end up with 50% of women at the top. You think of a pyramid, right? Because there's like 10 levels, right? So if they encounter a little bit of bias at every level, or if they encounter no bias at every level, then you have 50% at the top, in theory, right? Now, if you introduce just 1% bias into that model, you end up with 35% women at the top. So there's a big drop-off. I mean, it depends on how many repeated times there is, right? So there's kind of a big drop-off in how many you're going to see. So if we apply that logic to entrepreneurship, you can imagine that if over, just one little interaction, somebody's kind of like, oh, well, yeah, it's kind of an okay idea. Or, if there's a little bit of a bias in multiple interactions, you can see how that ends up discouraging women from entrepreneurship, or they may themselves start to discount their own abilities. So they might think, well, I don't really have what it takes to do this, so maybe I shouldn't do this. And it might not just be one person, right, who questions it. It might be, okay, well, after 10 people, that happens. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, it might disadvantage them when they seek financial support, but also social support. As I'm sure you know, it takes more than just one person to do the day-to-day activities of starting a business. You need network ties and allies, and this may also exist via formal versus informal sources of support, right? So some people say, oh, well, formal investors aren't biased. So, okay, that's fine. Maybe they aren't, even though some studies show they are, but they might not be that biased. But informal sources of support are growing, and we know that the average, so crowdfunding, for instance, or just other little ways of getting money is becoming more and more common, and these people aren't necessarily trained to evaluate business plans. It's just like, oh, do I think that's a good idea? If I think it's a good idea, I'm going to go for it. And the average person is likely to hold these kind of shared stereotypes. So women, of course, might be able to mitigate the disadvantaging effects of these biases by explicitly highlighting their innovativeness or their creativity. And that, of course, activates this, oh, she is willing to take a risk. She is willing to do this, which alleviates these doubts that people might come in with. But, of course, to ultimately eliminate, so in theory, women shouldn't have to do that, right? So to ultimately eliminate these biases, we'd have to think about how we can change these cultural stereotypes that we link to entrepreneurs, which is a bigger issue. But to be more specific and helpful, so we're not just going out of here depressed, there are some effective solutions that we can apply in this context. So we know that if we can break the tendency to use these cognitive shortcuts, there are little strategies we can use, that limits people's tendency to act on them and to have them impact people's lives. Specifically, reduce uncertainty whenever possible, and this can be done both by entrepreneurs and by the individuals who are evaluating them. Arm the choir, so simply educating people about these biases and about the tools that they can use to reduce the biases can help and limit their effects. And finally, we can think about strategies of promoting a more diverse vision of entrepreneurship when possible. So, lots of risk and creativity and successful entrepreneurship can come in a lot of different shapes and forms, not just that of a white man. All right, so what can women entrepreneurs do more concretely? So I'm not to say, of course it's not women entrepreneurs' fault, but as a kind of survival strategies, what could they do? So highlight uniqueness, highlight how your business model is new and different and better than others because of X, Y, and Z. And don't be afraid to do that aggressively. Provide and mention plenty of information about your qualifications and experience. Women have to do this more, so just getting out there all that good stuff about what you've done in the past, why you're qualified, generally be more self-promoting than you might otherwise be. So, the fact that it would be interesting to test this further, but the fact that I don't see this backlash effect, like there shouldn't be a reason to be afraid of being a little too, I don't know, aggressive or something. If you come off as aggressive, then, you come off as aggressive, but that actually in this situation appears to help women more than hurt them. Maybe in other situations it might hurt them, but in the situation of an entrepreneurial pitch, it seems to be a really good thing. And also promote other sources of legitimacy, so people you know who can vouch for you and demonstrate that you've got what it takes. And be persistent. So if you feel like kind of beaten down, just remember that well, maybe it'll take me more tries, and you can't control the way that other people perceive you. It's easy to say, but. And then what can investors, organizations, and educators do? So educate. So as I mentioned before, simply being aware that these stereotypes can unconsciously and unintentionally bias people's evaluations can help mitigate it. So just me telling you about this tonight, hopefully it will help you as you go forward. You might think about it twice. Just thinking about it twice. Just priming people that this is the mechanism. Like in studies, they've showed that then people are less likely to be biased if they actually know about it. Establish clear criteria before making evaluations. I know that sometimes this is hard in an entrepreneurial pitch situation, but trying to set some sort of clear criteria and evaluate whether that's the right criteria too for what you actually want. Holding decision makers accountable is really critical. So if you know that you're going to have to explain your decision to someone else, you're much less likely to be biased. So can this person offer concrete evidence to justify why a particular entrepreneur or a team is more investment worthy than the other? You can implement third-party checks and balances, so have a second opinion when possible. And finally, like I mentioned before, promote a more diverse vision of what entrepreneurship looks like and successful entrepreneurship looks like. So this can be done through recruitment tools and strategies if you're somebody like the technology management program. And thinking about the evaluation criteria that what counts as a good business model. So that's basically it. Thanks.